In this video, we're going to be looking at employment and unemployment. We're going to see how they're measured, types, causes, and consequences of unemployment. So first, let's go through a few definitions. Firstly, unemployment. So this is when individuals are without a job but actively seeking work. There's an official definition of unemployment used by the International Labour Organization. And this is that a person is unemployed when someone is out of work, has been looking for work, and is ready to start work in 2 weeks' time. Labour force is another key term, and essentially the labour force refers to those in work or actively seeking work, also known as the active population. In other words, it's those in work, so people who are employed, and those who aren't in a job but actively seeking work, in other words, the unemployed people. And so the labour force can just be thought of as the number of employed people and the number of unemployed people added together. Note that this doesn't include people who aren't economically active. In other words, people who aren't in work and people who aren't actively seeking work. So this may include students or people who are retired. So defining unemployment is all well and good, but arguably measuring unemployment is even more important. Because if policymakers know what the unemployment rate is, they have crucial information which will help them determine the best course of action in terms of driving economic policy. And we'll discuss this in more detail in a later video. There are two main methods of measuring unemployment. Firstly, the labour force survey, and secondly, the claimant count. The labour force survey measures unemployment based on the ILO, or International Labour Organization, definition of unemployment I referred to earlier. It uses a survey that's carried out monthly, asking people whether they are in work, looking for work, and if they're not looking for work, why they may not be looking for work. Like with most things, there are both advantages and disadvantages to this method of measuring unemployment. So one advantage is that the labour force survey is a method used by most countries internationally, and therefore if a policymaker wants to compare the unemployment rate in his or her country with that of a different country, then that policymaker can refer to labour force survey numbers. And therefore, the labour force survey makes unemployment rates internationally comparable. For reasons we'll get onto when we cover the claimant count, the labour force survey also tends to be a better indicator of unemployment. However, the labour force survey is very expensive. Carrying out a monthly telephonic survey bears a huge cost and takes up a lot of time which could be used in other areas. This is very much a real problem in poorer countries such as Somalia, where this process is way too expensive to be worth carrying out. And as a result, some countries just don't publish unemployment figures because the process of calculating them, of collecting the data, is far too expensive. There are also issues with sampling errors. A survey is always going to feature errors. For example, people may not understand the questionnaire or may intentionally lie. In both cases, the survey picks up inaccuracies. Let's move on now to the claimant count. So the claimant count is used in the UK as an alternative measure of unemployment. It counts the number of people receiving unemployment benefits, job seekers allowance or JSA in particular. One benefit with the claimant count is the collection of information is much cheaper to carry out, as the data already exists on government databases, and so there's no need to go out and run a survey. Precisely because of this, this makes the claimant count a very quick method of measuring unemployment. This means that claimant count figures are often available much earlier than LFS figures. However, because the claimant count is something carried out primarily by the UK, this doesn't make it an internationally comparable figure. One reason for this is because not all countries offer unemployment benefits to start off with. Now here's this key issue of inaccuracies. The claimant count figure leaves out many unemployed people who don't qualify for job seekers allowance. This is why the claimant count usually returns lower figures than the LFS estimate, and therefore why the claimant count tends to underestimate the number of unemployed people in the UK. And we can see this on a graph. As you can see here, the LFS is denoted by the blue line over time, and the claimant count is denoted by the red line over time. As you can see, consistently since 1971, the claimant count figure has been lower than the LFS figure. This shows that the claimant count consistently underestimates unemployment rates. However, neither indicator is perfect at conveying the state of the workforce, and there are two main reasons for this: underemployment and inactivity. Firstly, underemployment. People may be officially classed as employed, but society may not be fully utilizing their skills. For example, we say that an individual is underemployed when they are either working less hours than they want to, or are in jobs below their skill level. An interesting example of this is in Cuba, where people trained as doctors decide to work as taxi drivers due to the better salaries. When underemployment occurs, it means that although people are employed, they aren't being used to their full potential. And secondly, inactivity. Another issue is that people who have been unemployed over a long period of time may become discouraged and stop seeking a job entirely. In this case, they may stop relying on JSA and may start relying on other benefits such as sickness or disability allowance, and leave the labour market entirely. People who do this are no longer classed as unemployed, but economically inactive. An increase in the economically inactive population will likely lead to a fall in the unemployment rate, which may misleadingly be interpreted as the success of government policies to get more unemployed people back into work. Therefore, when the unemployment rate goes down, it doesn't necessarily mean that more people are in work, because it could also mean that less people are looking for work, and therefore more people are economically inactive. Although unemployment in general refers to people being out of work but seeking work, there are different reasons why people are unemployed: structural, frictional, seasonal, cyclical, and voluntary. Structural unemployment is when the pattern of demand and production changes, leaving workers unemployed in labour markets where demand has sunk. Essentially, when whole sectors decline in countries, a historical example of this would be the shipbuilding industries in the north of England. When these sectors decline, this could leave large numbers of people unemployed. Another example of this is in 2009, when automaker General Motors cut 10,000 jobs at Opel, its European division, as a result of poor sales. And therefore we can see here that possibly the car industry in general in Europe is on the decline, and therefore this is why people have been made unemployed. And so this can be thought of as an increase in structural unemployment. There's also frictional unemployment. This is when workers are unemployed for short lengths of time between jobs. And so when people leave one job and start another, there tends to be a buffer period between leaving one job and starting the next one, and therefore people are frictionally unemployed in this period. This isn't too much of an issue for an economy because people in frictional unemployment will soon re-enter the workforce. There's also seasonal unemployment. This is when workers are unemployed at certain times of the year. This usually happens in jobs in the tourism industry, such as in holiday resorts, restaurants, and tourist attractions, as people who are employed to handle demand from tourists in the summer are no longer needed in the winter when few people visit. Agricultural workers can also face the same problem, as they may only be needed for the planting and harvesting seasons. Cyclical unemployment occurs when there is insufficient demand in the economy for all workers who wish to work at current wages to get a job. This is very much linked to the economic cycle of boom, downturn, recession, and recovery. During downturns, business activity slows, and as a result, the derived demand for labor is reduced, meaning that some workers are laid off. This period of rising unemployment becomes lengthened and more painful if the economy enters a recession. And lastly, voluntary unemployment. Voluntary unemployment results from workers refusing to take paid jobs because they consider that the wage rates for such jobs are too low, especially in relation to the benefits that they receive. In other words, a minority of people in society choose not to work, even though they may be able to work and work is available for them, usually because they're content with the unemployment benefits they receive. And in this scenario, people may decide not to work, in which case they are part of voluntary unemployment. Unemployment is usually harmful for an economy, but in some cases, unemployment can be beneficial. For example, high levels of unemployment means that the available supply of labor is high. For employers, this means that there's a larger pool of workers offering their services, and therefore, because the supply of labor increases, wages go down because there's higher competition for work. If you haven't learnt about labor markets yet, don't worry, because you can think about the labor market as any other market for any other good. It's just that the good being sold in this case is labor. So lower wages being paid by firms means that these firms' costs of production decrease as well. And this makes these firms more internationally competitive, as they may be able to pass down the cost benefits in the form of reduced prices for consumers. Like I said though, there are multiple disadvantages of unemployment. For example, high unemployment means that a government that runs unemployment benefit programs, such as the UK with JSA, these governments will have to face the greater opportunity cost of financing a bigger welfare bill. And when I talk about opportunity cost, what I'm referring to is the issue that arises when you spend money in one area, but because you're spending money in that area, you're not able to spend money in other places. And therefore, if the government increases welfare spending, this reduces the amount of money they can spend on education or on the NHS. And therefore, there's an opportunity cost. In other words, the cost of increased welfare spending is the foregone benefits of spending more in the education department to hire more teachers. Secondly, unemployment means that less people are employed, and therefore the government receives less income tax. Less people employed also likely means that people will spend less in the local economy, and so the government is also likely to receive less VAT. All this means a reduction in tax revenue. Unemployment also could lead to an increase in social problems or social unrest. Areas of high unemployment, especially high levels of youth unemployment, tend to have more crime and vandalism. Unemployment can also lead to alienation and difficulties in integrating young, unemployed people into society. So we've been talking about the costs of unemployment on a national level, but there are personal costs for the unemployed themselves. Prolonged periods of unemployment can push households into debt and increase rates of relative poverty, meaning a reduction in living standards. So we finished the material on employment and unemployment, so here's a news article to do with this topic. As usual, there are questions and the extension. Thank you very much for listening.